A park ranger, while working and doing his duties, sees a trail of smoke off in the distance. And so he does what any good park ranger would do, and he follows that trail of smoke, only to find a village completely untouched by the modern world. Now, as he goes into this village, he notices that it is full of people who are very kind, very generous, who are greeting him, talking to him. And as this park ranger is having conversations with all of these villagers and trying to find out why he never knew about this village in the first place, he uncovers a series of disturbing and very unsettling realizations about not just the villagers, but the village itself. Now, afterwards, he returns back to the ranger station, completely shocked and terrified by his experiences, to only tell the other rangers what he experienced, and they don't know how to explain it. And in fact, it was then, shortly after, he learns the disturbing truth behind the entire thing, a hideous twist to the entire story. You won't want to miss this one. Several years back, Gregory had been a park ranger working at this particular national park for several years. And while he never gave the exact name of the national park, he referred to it as Elysian Grove. And his day started out like any other. He arrived at work, he started checking in, he would make his way around the trails, doing his rounds, looking for anything he could do to fill his time, when while he was working on the trail, he noticed something completely out of place. Off in the distance, several miles, was a large plume of smoke. Thinking it was a fire, he decided to act quickly and go in that direction to see what it was. Now, as he arrived closer to this plume of smoke, or at least the source of it, he discovered that it was actually an entire village that seemed to be untouched by time itself. Now, he would go on to say that the village he discovered wasn't this large ancient metropolis, but rather a small, quaint little village just tucked neatly away in the woods, and would even describe how the buildings were made so finely out of stone and wood as if they were erected from the ground itself. And in fact, even all the forestry and trees surrounding the village were very tall, very overgrown, so kind of in a way protected the village from outsiders seeing into it, if that makes any sense. And as he approached this village, which he had never seen before, he could see that it was very live and active. People were bustling around, doing their normal daily life chores and intermingling with each other and having a good time. It was clearly a sight to behold. But immediately, he noticed that the people inside the village were moving different than normal people. You see, they almost moved in a very cautious way, as if they didn't want to be seen at all. And as he got closer and looked more, he could see that he was correct. There was a plume of smoke, and that the plume of smoke was actually coming from a large fire that was in the center of the village. Now, Gregory would later recount how taken aback he was by seeing this village that looked very out of place here in the middle of the woods, only a few miles away from a main road. And as he's trying to process all this and take this in, he's wondering a couple things. Number one, why has he never seen this village before? And number two, why has nobody told him about it? Clearly, this isn't tucked away, and so he's very curious now and wants to get to the bottom of why there's this village here and who's living in it. So he makes his way closer to the village, climbing through the bushes and trees to get closer, and as he's doing so, he notices a few more things. That the village itself seems to be completely untouched by anything of our modern world. He began to think that maybe these people were cosplaying, or maybe this was some sort of, reenactment of some kind of ancient history. He wasn't sure, but the people who took notice of him were very friendly. They started greeting him, they began talking to him, and while the atmosphere that Gregory felt from the people who were around him was very warm and inviting, he just couldn't get that feeling out of the pit of his stomach that something was very wrong that he was about to discover. Now, as he's taking his time and exploring the village and talking to all these people, he notices there's a lot of really off-putting things about these people, things that we'll get into very shortly if you stick around. Now, one thing he noted in particular was that these people not only were able to communicate with him, but they spoke a very strange language to each other, a language he did not recognize, and that there was just something so off about the individuals he was speaking to that they just were different than anyone he'd ever talked to before or even met. Now keep in mind that Gregory spent several hours here, and he would describe that their customs and beliefs were very, very different than anything he had ever encountered in the modern world. It was almost as if he had stepped into a dream itself, because everything seemed far too perfect, too serene, too real. It was just off-putting. Something he noticed that was very off-putting about the villagers, besides all the things he already noted, was that they seemed as if nothing was wrong, nothing could bother them, everything was too perfect. There was no conflict, nothing. And Gregory would say that he firmly believed for a while that he was actually in a reenactment or a movie set, because everything was too clean and pristine and perfect, and that it missed the messiness of real life. Now, apparently he had stayed for some hours intermingling with these people because it began to get dark, and he noticed a few other qualities about them as it got darker that really bothered him. And so he had the feeling of dread creeping in on him, and he realized he needed to get back to the ranger station and tell them exactly what he had discovered. Now, once he said his goodbyes to the villagers and left and went on his way, he got in his quad, and going back to the ranger station, he noted that things got even more unsettling, that the forest almost seemed to have come alive around him in a very dreadful way. Even though there was no obvious signs of life, like no crickets or any nightlife sounds, it was as if he would describe the forest around him was watching him and almost reaching out to him. It made him feel very uneasy. Things were not as it seems. And so he's driving his way back to the ranger station, and the forest was different than what he remembered. It was almost as if it was closing around in on him. Now at this point, he's very on edge. He is feeling very vulnerable. He has no idea what's happening or why this is happening. Now he's finally able to make it back to the ranger station where he works at, and he begins talking to his fellow rangers who are working there, explaining to them exactly what he experienced, where it was at, and what he went through, and none of them could explain it, because apparently the spot that this village was in did not exist, or at least recently, because here is the twist. Now, as it turns out, that a few days after this experience, as he's taken his time to process it and talk to more people who he worked with and that were close to him, he found out that apparently in that spot many years ago, there used to be a village that sat there but was eventually wiped out to some sort of calamity, and we only know what happens after that. Time took it over and it eventually just ceased to exist, including structures and people. And while that in and of itself is very unsettling and bizarre, what's stranger is what he experienced while he was in the village. You see, when he started talking to these people and seeing them, he noticed a set of very abnormal, almost supernatural behavioral patterns. For example, he noted that none of the people who he talked to or saw, none of them had shadows. Their clothes were all old-fashioned, and anytime they would enter or exit a building, they would walk backwards. And on top of the no shadows and the entering and exiting buildings backward, none of them ever made a sound when stepping or walking around on the ground. Now, in conjunction with all of this, he claimed there was just this atmosphere lingering all around him, a feeling like he was not supposed to be there, that he did not belong and he should have left. Now, of course, he stayed there for a while because he was trying to get down to the bottom of it. He had no way to explain what it was that was happening. And as I stated earlier, as night began to fall on the village, he noticed probably one of the most disturbing details is that all the villagers, their eyes began to glow this almost soft yellow color. And he began to convince himself that the people around him were so strange and out of place that he was convinced they were not human. Now, this alone terrified him, and so that's why he had to get his way back to the ranger station and tell his fellow colleagues what exactly had transpired and what he saw. Now, the village that Gregory supposedly saw and all the people within it is still a mystery. In fact, Gregory believes that he became a victim of what's known commonly as time slips. Now, time slips is a phenomenon that happens to actually a lot of people because there are many accounts of it, And supposedly, it's when someone has an experience where they time slip into some sort of alternate dimension or universe. It's almost like a fleeting glimpse into another world or time. And in fact, there are a multitude of stories just like Gregory's that go back years and years, and also happens all over the globe, and is not just confined to the United States or to Western Europe or Africa. It's everywhere. An unnamed self-proclaimed professional trekker and hiker who was working with an agency had posted their own strange story to a website called Tripodo. Now, the agency in which he worked for would organize trips and hikes and treks all across India and the Himalayan mountains. Now, it was during this time frame that this individual was out alone deep in the mountains and the woods, trying to find and write down new trails to explore and hike, and just trying to find new adventures that he could document. Now, as he's going along the trail with his handy notebook and he's writing things down and taking notes and just enjoying the beautiful, serene scenery that he's surrounded in, he notices that someone is coming up to him from the woods, and as he looks, he notices that it is a young woman. Now, as he's looking at her, he doesn't notice anything off-putting about her because she's dressed in the typical clothing that people in that area would wear, so he wasn't off-put at all by her or her appearance or her presence, because even though the area he was in was very remote, there were little tiny villages here and there throughout, so he just thought it was one of them who was coming up to converse with him. Now, as this woman approached him, she seemed very kind, very caring, and she had asked him plain as day if he was in need of any water, food, or shelter, if he was okay, did he need any medical help, and of course, to respond to this, he gladly accepted because he had already been out there for a while. And so after he accepted, she began leading him towards her village, which at this point in time was not too far away from the trail he was on, and it was a tiny village called Pindon, or Pindon. And it was here he was welcomed with open arms. It's not like the last story where everything was kind of weird and off-putting. They fed him a very hearty meal, they were talking to him, treated him like family. And later on that evening, he was even invited to join in on the celebration of the coming monsoons. And for this particular village, they celebrated that event by sacrificing the largest bull they had. And then after that, the village would partake in a wonderful, delicious feast. And so he ate his fill, they housed him, they gave him a nice warm bed. He decided to crash out and enjoy his night of slumber in this peaceful, wonderful village. Upon waking up the next morning, they also fed him a large, hearty breakfast, making sure that their village guest was well rested, well fed before he went on his way. And of course, as he was exiting the village, he would wave goodbye to everybody, but things would start to get really weird. And as he's making his way back down the trails, he can't wait to share the amazing stories that he had at this village with some of his other friends and family. And over the course of the following 5 days, he would hike his way along the mountains, just looking again for more trails and things to explore and to note down. Now, he had also come across several other towns like Ajag and Perthi, which were nearby villages as well. Now, as he begins to trek into some more treacherous, difficult terrain, I mean, not for the locals, but for him, and he also realizes that some of the more amateur trekkers would not be able to handle this kind of terrain, he decides to turn around and go back the way he came towards the village of Pindon, which he stayed at roughly about 5 or 6 days prior. Now, going back in that same direction, his initial goal was to go and stay at a much larger village, but he knew that going back the way he was going, he would be able to stop and rest at the Pindon village like he did before, and so he was very excited by this. Now, 2 days later, as he's making his trek back, he gets to right about the exact same spot where he met the beautiful young woman who had initially invited him to her village of Pindon, and her name, by the way, was Tana. And so he gets to this spot, and he's trying to remember the exact location that she took him, and he's like, okay, yeah, I remember now. And so he goes the exact same route that he remembers her taking him. and he's going and he's going. Now he's going for quite a while, maybe even up to about 30 minutes at this point, and he's starting to remember that it didn't take this long to get to the village originally. Now at this point, there was no sight of the village anywhere, and he couldn't quite figure out why. It's not like there was a bunch of places to go. This area was rather desolate, and the area which she led him to wasn't far away. So in light of this, he decides to turn around, head back to the main road, and wait for some assistance. And it was evening at this time, so it was starting to get dark out, and so he sees a lone rider coming on the road, and he flags the man down and stops him. And so our guide began to ask this stranger about a village that was nearby, and where was it, why wasn't it there? And the stranger just insisted that there was no such village anywhere around that he was describing. And so he began to go and describe the Bull Monsoon Festival and being taken by a girl named Tana and being fed lots of great food and just immersing himself in this miniature culture for almost an entire half a day. And it was at this point the stranger's face began to get pale. And then he confessed that he knew about it. That apparently there was no such village like that has ever existed, but apparently there is a plethora of other stories from other people in the area who have experienced the exact same thing that our individual also experienced. And as far as this trekker knows, is that there is 4 other people who have all individually set foot and visited this same village of Pandan, a village that supposedly doesn't exist. Now, whether this is a case of a time slip or an alternate reality, it's still a mystery to this day. In the fall of 1957, 3 cadets from the British Royal Navy were sent out into the English countryside in Suffolk for a map reading training mission. Well, technically it was more of an exercise, but the 3 cadets in question were William Lang, Michael Crowley, and Ray Baker. Now their mission was simple, was to follow the map and make note of a few different destinations and locations along the scenic route in which they were traveling. Now at this time in the year, it was October, just like it is now, so all the leaves in the countryside was just starting to change from summer into autumn, and ladies and gentlemen, we all know how beautiful that is and how you want to take your time and just look at everything and marvel at the beauty around you. And that's what these 3 gentlemen did. Now remember that their job was to map a route to their waypoint and then report back to their superiors of what they found. Now at this point, it was a clear, sunny, beautiful fall day. There was nothing out of the ordinary. There was nothing weird happening. It was pretty much just plain and ordinary, like you would expect. Now it was during this time along their route that they would pass by a small little hamlet known more commonly as Kersey, I believe they call it. It's this charming little village, only about a few hundred people populated in total, and it's known for having historical medieval buildings and for just how busy it still is. Now they're making their way along the route and they could see Kersey off in the distance. Now Kersey was also an assigned location on their route, so they decided to go closer. And as they were there from afar, they could hear the church bells going off, they could see plumes of smoke coming up the chimneys, they could hear the birds singing. It was a beautiful day and they were expecting a very pleasant experience. But ladies and gentlemen, we all know how these things go. So as they got closer to the village, things began to change for the worse, or maybe I should say for the stranger. It all began with a thick wall of silence, right? All of a sudden the church bells stop, the smoke stops coming out of the chimney, and everything gets really, really quiet, as if they have just passed through some sort of invisible threshold of complete and utter silence. There wasn't even any birds chirping or making noises, no squirrels, no wildlife, nothing. And these 3 cadets were very disturbed by this, and they noted that not only had everything gone silent, but it was as if time itself had completely froze. The leaves had completely stopped rustling on the trees. There was no sounds, there was no wind, and even some of the ducks in the nearby pond were completely motionless. And despite it being a beautiful day and that there was just smoke and the church bells going, there was not a soul to be seen anywhere around the village. And keep in mind that this village isn't like obscured by thick forestry and, hidden out of view. It's you could see the streets, it's very open. And if it was as busy as it should have been, there should have been at least a soul around in sight, but there wasn't. And they would go on to describe it like a ghost village because it was so empty. And all three cadets made mention that they all felt this wave of depression and sadness just wash over them, and a strong feeling of unfriendliness, like they weren't supposed to be there. However, things would continue to get stranger as the men would walk the streets looking for signs of anybody. They would come across an old window that belonged to a butcher shop, and one of the cadets, being curious, decided to go and peer in and see what he could see. Now, he noted that there was no tables, no chairs, no countertops. There was nothing in this room in which he was looking in, just 3 full oxen carcasses. But here is where the twist comes in, and it gets very, very strange. These 3 oxen carcasses were not only skinned and stuck there, or hanging there I should say, but they were green with age and moldy and just nasty. Everything inside and around them looked run down and just dilapidated. And keep in mind as well that around them, there was nothing else to be seen. There was no cars, there was no bicycles, there was no electrical wiring, no telephone poles. And although Kersey has many old-fashioned medieval kind of buildings and the roads are cobblestone, there was still no signs of life anywhere. In fact, there was nothing modern surrounding them at all. Everything looked to be of medieval fashion, of old timber framing. All hand-built, all the windows are now covered in grime and just old slime and moss, like they hadn't been taken care of in a very, very long time. Now, adding to this bizarre situation and the surreal quality of what they were already experiencing, they noticed this, that the trees themselves were now different than where they had been just only a little bit before on the trail during their mission. One of the cadets made the mention that the leaves and the tree was verdant a vibrant, bright green. The same kind of green you see on leaves and trees in the beginning of spring when everything grows back in and it's lush and vibrant. It was no longer looking like it was autumn. So all 3 cadets start talking amongst themselves, trying to figure out what's going on here. Why is there no one around? Why is everything out of place and strange? None of this makes sense. And so they start going around individually, peering in other windows of other houses, just hoping to find another soul around. Nobody. There's no one around. In fact, when they're looking in the windows of the other houses, they don't see a soul in there. There's no tables, there's no chairs, there's no furniture, no signs of life. These houses are completely empty, completely vacant, without a soul anywhere. They claimed it was as if all the residents of the village decided to take all their possessions, furniture included, and suddenly abandon ship in an instant. Now, the church tower, the one with the bell, they thought would be one of the best spots to go and collect their bearings and maybe talk to somebody, because certainly somebody would be there or near there, and which, by the way, they could very visibly see this bell tower or church tower from outside the village. And upon going to this location, there was no sign of a church or a church tower anywhere. It was as if it had suddenly vanished from sight. And of course, you can only imagine how ominous and how dreadful and creepy this must have felt to these 3 clueless cadets who had no idea what was going on. And this isn't like the first story where this village was a village that wasn't supposed to exist or was a village from an old time past. This was an actual established village, and none of this made sense. So not sure what to do at this point, all 3 cadets just shrugged their shoulders, feeling uneasy and eerie about the whole thing. They just decided to go back on their mission, get back on the trail, and go to the initial waypoint. Now, as they exited the village, things would change yet again. Abruptly, things returned back to normal. They could hear the birds singing again, the squirrels and all the wildlife come back suddenly. They could hear the church bells, which was supposedly gone just moments before, now back in full force, and people going back and forth, and smoke plumes coming from the chimneys. They didn't know what to think of it, and all 3 cadets were completely taken aback by their own experience of what had just happened, and so they made their way to their waypoint and eventually got back to their superiors, and they would tell their superiors exactly what had happened. Now, this wasn't just one man's account, but 3 who would all corroborate the exact same story. Of course, the superiors would confirm that yes, they had made it to the village or the hamlet of Kersey, but what they experienced in it was simply just nothing. It was a figment of their imagination. Maybe they were exhausted, they dreamt it. It didn't make sense. They blew it off. Now, whether or not these 3 cadets had experienced a time slip that had potentially set them into many, many, many years in the past is still unknown and up for debate to this day. And if you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment down below, time slip, so I know who made it to the end of the video. And if you guys want more content just like this, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more content from yours truly. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.